The courtroom falls silent as the judge's gavel strikes the wooden block. 68-year-old Marcus Washington, decorated Army Ranger and Bronze Star recipient, sits in handcuffs while the jury deliberates his fate for charges that should never have been filed. Outside, protesters chant for justice, their voices echoing through the marble halls of the Detroit courthouse. What they don't know is that in 15 minutes, a military transport will arrive carrying Colonel Patricia Williams, the one woman who can save him and reveal the truth that's been buried for 45 years. But will she arrive in time to prevent the greatest injustice of Marcus's life? Before we dive into this incredible story of courage and redemption, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you believe that true heroes deserve recognition regardless of their race, please hit that like button and subscribe because tomorrow's special episode reveals shocking government secrets you definitely don't want to miss. 4 weeks earlier, Marcus Washington sat alone in Rosie's kitchen on Corktown Avenue in downtown Detroit. The 68-year-old Army veteran maintained his military bearing even in the cracked leather booth, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of black coffee. Gray streaks ran through his neatly trimmed goatee, and despite the early morning hour of 5:45 a.m., he was already dressed in pressed khakis and a crisp button-down shirt. His faded 82nd Airborne cap sat on the table beside a folded copy of the Detroit Free Press. The diner was nearly empty except for a handful of factory workers grabbing breakfast before their shifts at the nearby Ford plant. Marcus preferred these quiet morning hours, a routine he'd maintained for 18 years since retiring from his position as a high school history teacher at Cass Technical High School. The Bronze Star medal pinned to his jacket caught the fluorescent light as he turned the newspaper pages, reading about local politics and community events with the same methodical attention he'd once applied to scanning hostile territory through night vision scopes. At 6 a.m., the bell above the diner chimed as 4 white college students stumbled in, their clothes reeking of alcohol and marijuana from what was obviously an all-night party. Chad Morrison, a 20-year-old University of Michigan dropout with bleached hair and expensive designer sneakers, led the group to a booth near Marcus's table. His companions, Kyle Patterson, 19, Derek Collins, 20, and Austin Sullivan, 18, all clearly from wealthy suburban families based on their designer clothes and entitled swagger, followed with the arrogance of young men who'd never faced real consequences for their actions. "Look at this old black dude hogging the best booth," Chad announced loudly, not bothering to lower his voice. "Probably been sitting here all night nursing 1 cup of coffee like they always do, taking up space that paying customers could use." Marcus looked up from his newspaper, his expression calm but alert. The other customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one spoke up. Rosa Martinez, the waitress who'd served Marcus faithfully for years, shot an apologetic look from behind the counter but continued wiping down glasses with nervous energy, her hands trembling slightly. "Man, I bet he's one of those welfare cases," Kyle added, sliding into the booth with deliberate loudness. "My dad says they just hang out in places like this because they got nowhere else to go. Probably collecting disability for some fake PTSD or something." Derek laughed cruelly. "Yeah, these old veterans are always claiming they're heroes when they probably just sat behind a desk somewhere safe. Now they want handouts for the rest of their lives." Marcus folded his newspaper carefully and set it aside, his movements deliberate and controlled. "Gentlemen," he said in a quiet, measured voice that carried decades of military authority and classroom discipline, "I'm not looking for any trouble this morning. Perhaps you could keep your voices down so everyone can enjoy their breakfast in peace." The request was polite, reasonable, and delivered with the kind of respect Marcus had learned during his 22 years of military service. But Chad's face flushed red with anger and something else Marcus recognized from his years in combat zones, the kind of privileged rage that comes from being challenged by someone you consider beneath you. "Did this old man just tell us what to do?" Chad stood up abruptly, his voice rising to attract attention from everyone in the diner. "Did this threatening old black guy just try to intimidate us? This is America, old man. We have the right to talk as loud as we want." Marcus remained seated, his hands visible on the table, making no aggressive moves whatsoever. "I simply asked you to lower your voices, nothing more. I meant no disrespect." He's threatening us. Austin jumped up, pulling out his phone to start recording. This crazy veteran is threatening innocent people. Someone needs to call the police before he snaps. Yeah, someone call 911, Derek added, his voice taking on a panicked tone. This guy looks dangerous. You never know what these unstable vets might do. Rosa stepped forward from behind the counter, her voice shaking but determined. That's not what happened. Mr. Washington was just asking them to be quiet. He didn't threaten anyone. He's been coming here for years and he's always been a perfect gentleman. But Chad was already on his phone with 911, his voice taking on a panicked tone that would have been laughable if the consequences weren't so serious. Help. There's a dangerous black man at Rosie's kitchen threatening to hurt us. He looks like he might have weapons. He's talking about his military training and how he knows ways to deal with people like us. Please hurry. Marcus felt a familiar chill run down his spine, the same sensation he'd experienced in Afghanistan when he realized he was walking into an ambush. He'd survived 4 tours of duty, earned a Bronze Star and Purple Heart, and taught thousands of students about American history and democratic values. But in this moment, in a diner where he'd been a regular customer for nearly 2 decades, he knew he was facing a different kind of warfare. Within 5 minutes, 4 police cruisers arrived with sirens blaring and lights flashing. Officers David Thompson and Maria Gonzalez burst through the door with their hands on their weapons, immediately scanning the room for threats. Their eyes locked onto Marcus, the only black person in the establishment, and their body language shifted into aggressive mode. That's him, Chad pointed dramatically at Marcus, who remained seated with his hands visible on the table. He threatened to hurt us, said he knew ways to make people disappear from his time in the military. He said young punks like us needed to learn respect the hard way. Marcus had said no such thing, but the officers didn't bother to ask for his side of the story or question the obvious intoxication of the accusers. Officer Thompson, a 12-year veteran with a documented history of complaints from minority communities, approached Marcus's table with his hand resting on his service weapon. Stand up slowly and put your hands behind your back, Thompson commanded, his voice carrying the kind of authority that brooked no argument. Officer, there seems to be a misunderstanding, Marcus began, rising slowly from his seat, his movements careful and non-threatening. I simply asked these young men to lower their voices. I made no threats of any kind. I'm a retired teacher and veteran. I've never been in trouble with the law. Save it for the judge, Thompson snapped, roughly grabbing Marcus's arms and forcing them behind his back. The metal handcuffs clicked shut with unnecessary force, pinching the skin on Marcus's wrists. You're under arrest for terroristic threatening and disturbing the peace. Rosa tried to intervene again, her voice rising with desperation. Officers, I saw everything. Mr. Washington didn't threaten anyone. These boys were drunk and causing trouble. He was just trying to eat his breakfast in peace. He's a good man who served his country. Officer Gonzalez turned on the waitress with a dismissive wave. Ma'am, we need you to step back and let us do our job. We have multiple witnesses saying this man made threats. We have to take these allegations seriously. The multiple witnesses were the 4 teenagers who had fabricated the entire incident, but their word carried more weight than the truth. Marcus's Bronze Star medal, visible on his jacket, might as well have been invisible to the officers who saw only a black man accused by white victims. As they led Marcus toward the police car, his 82nd Airborne cap fell to the floor of the diner, landing beside the newspaper he'd been reading peacefully just minutes before. The headline visible on the open page read, "Local Veterans Honored for Service," a bitter irony that wasn't lost on the man now being treated like a common criminal. The ride to the Wayne County Jail took 18 minutes, during which officers Thompson and Gonzalez discussed Marcus as if he weren't sitting in the back seat. They speculated about his criminal history, wondered aloud whether he might be one of those unstable veterans they'd been warned about in training, and debated whether his military service made him more dangerous than typical suspects. Marcus said nothing, knowing from experience that silence was often the wisest course when facing overwhelming force. He thought about his late wife, Sarah, who had died 3 years earlier from cancer, and how she would have been heartbroken to see him in handcuffs. He thought about his daughter, Angela, working as a nurse in Chicago, and how this would devastate her when she found out. At the jail, Marcus was processed like any other suspect. His fingerprints were taken, his photograph snapped for the mugshot that would later appear on evening news broadcasts across Detroit. His personal effects were catalogued and stored: wallet containing $67, house keys, reading glasses, and a worn photograph of Sarah and Angela at Angela's nursing school graduation. His Bronze Star Medal was noted as decorative pin on the property sheet. The charges were filed within 3 hours: terroristic threatening in the second degree, disturbing the peace, and intimidating witnesses. Bail was set at $75,000, an amount that would require Marcus to put up his modest home as collateral. For a man living on a teacher's pension and Social Security, it might as well have been $75 million. By evening, the story had reached local news stations. Channel 7 led with "Veteran Threatens College Students at Downtown Diner," showing Marcus's mugshot alongside smiling social media photos of Chad, Kyle, Derek, and Austin. The narrative was set before Marcus even had a chance to speak with a lawyer: dangerous black veteran terrorizes innocent white college students. The fact that the victims were drunk, disorderly, and had fabricated the entire incident was lost in the rush to broadcast breaking news. The story fit too perfectly into existing narratives about unstable veterans and dangerous black men for anyone to question its veracity. Marcus spent his first night in county jail in a cell with 3 other men awaiting trial. As he lay on the thin mattress staring at the concrete ceiling, he couldn't help but think about the country he'd served for over 2 decades in places like Somalia, Iraq, and Afghanistan. He thought about the students he'd taught about justice and equality, and the Constitution he'd sworn to defend. Somewhere in the darkness, he wondered if the America he'd fought for had ever really existed, or if it had always been a dream deferred for people who looked like him. The Bronze Star Medal that had meant so much to him was sitting in a property envelope, reduced to evidence in a case that threatened to destroy the reputation he'd spent a lifetime building. The Wayne County Superior Court had seen its share of high-profile cases, but the prosecution of Marcus Washington brought out a level of media attention that surprised even veteran court observers. By the time Marcus's arraignment took place, 5 days after his arrest, protesters had gathered on both sides of the courthouse steps, creating a volatile atmosphere that required additional security from the Detroit Police Department. Marcus's court-appointed attorney, Jennifer Walsh, a recent law school graduate working her second year in the public defender's office, was overwhelmed from the start. With a caseload of over 120 active cases, she had approximately 35 minutes to review Marcus's file before their first meeting in the concrete interview room at the county jail. "Mr. Washington, I've looked over the charges against you," she began, flipping through pages that contained more gaps than actual investigation. "The state has 4 witnesses who say you threatened them with violence. That's going to be very difficult to overcome, especially given the current political climate around veteran-related violence." Marcus sat across from her in his orange jumpsuit, maintaining the same dignity he'd carried through multiple combat deployments in hostile territories. "Ms. Walsh, I never threatened those young men. I asked them politely to lower their voices. That's all that happened. I've never been violent outside of military combat situations." "I understand that's your version of events," she replied, already sounding defeated, "but we have to be realistic about what we're facing here. District Attorney Rebecca Martinez is prosecuting this case personally, which means she sees it as a high-priority conviction. She's running for mayor on a tough-on-crime platform." What Marcus didn't know was that Rebecca Martinez was trailing her opponent by 12 points in mayoral polls, but a high-profile conviction of a dangerous veteran could shift public opinion in her favor. Local focus groups had shown that voters were particularly concerned about veteran-related violence, making Marcus's case a perfect opportunity for political gain. The preliminary hearing took place in Judge Robert Harrison's courtroom, a wood-paneled chamber that had hosted Detroit justice for over 80 years. Judge Harrison, a white man in his early 60s, had a reputation for running an efficient courtroom, but his efficiency often came at the expense of thorough examination of evidence or consideration of defendants' rights. Jury selection proved to be the first major obstacle for Marcus's defense. The jury pool was drawn from Wayne County voter rolls, which skewed heavily towards suburban areas with predominantly white populations. Potential jurors were asked basic questions about their ability to be impartial, but deeper questions about racial bias or attitudes toward veterans were deemed irrelevant by Judge Harrison. "We're not trying social issues here," Judge Harrison declared when Walsh attempted to ask potential jurors about their views on military service and PTSD. "We're trying specific criminal charges against this defendant." The final jury consisted of 9 white jurors, 2 Hispanic jurors, and 1 black woman who worked as a security guard at a downtown office building. During voir dire, several potential jurors had openly expressed skepticism about veterans, particularly those who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan. "Those guys came back messed up," one dismissed juror had said. "You never know what might set them off. They're trained to kill, and that training doesn't just disappear when they come home." Media coverage of the jury selection process focused heavily on Marcus's military background, but not in a way that helped his case. Channel 7's legal analyst, former prosecutor David Kelly, appeared on the evening news to discuss the unique challenges of prosecuting veterans. "Veterans with combat experience can be unpredictable," Kelly explained to viewers. "They're trained killers who've seen violence most of us can't imagine. When they feel threatened or cornered, that training can kick in with dangerous results. The prosecution will likely focus on Mr. Washington's military service as evidence of his capacity for violence. The fact that Marcus had served his country with honor, earned decorations for bravery, and spent 25 years teaching American history to Detroit high school students was mentioned only in passing. The narrative had already been established: dangerous veteran threatens innocent civilians." 5 days before the trial began, Marcus's daughter Angela drove down from Chicago, where she worked as a trauma nurse at Rush University Medical Center. She'd taken unpaid leave to attend her father's trial, despite the financial hardship it represented for her family. "Dad, I found a private attorney who might take the case," she told him during visiting hours at the county jail. "Michael Rodriguez has experience with discrimination cases and wrongful prosecutions. He thinks we might have grounds for a civil rights lawsuit after this is over." Marcus shook his head slowly. "Angela, honey, I can't ask you to spend money you don't have. Mr. Rodriguez probably charges more in an hour than I get in pension payments all month. You have your own family to think about. This isn't about money, Dad. This is about justice. You served this country for 22 years. You taught students about the Constitution and civil rights for 25 years. You don't deserve this treatment." But justice, as Marcus was learning, was often a luxury that only the wealthy could afford. Private attorneys required retainers that started at $50,000, money that neither Marcus nor his daughter possessed. The American dream of equal justice under law seemed to apply only to those who could afford to purchase it. The media circus intensified as the trial date approached. Local news stations ran nightly segments about the case, almost always leading with Marcus's mugshot and referring to him as the accused veteran. Chad Morrison's family hired a public relations firm to handle media requests, ensuring that their son was portrayed as a victim of veteran violence rather than a privileged college dropout who had fabricated criminal charges. One particularly damaging piece aired on Channel 4's evening newscast 3 days before trial. The segment, titled "When Veterans Attack," featured interviews with psychiatrists who had never met Marcus but were willing to speculate about the underlying trauma that might drive a veteran to threaten civilians. Iraq and Afghanistan veterans in particular carry psychological scars that may not manifest for decades, explained Dr. Amanda Foster, a psychiatrist who specialized in PTSD but had never treated a veteran. A seemingly minor confrontation can trigger flashbacks to combat situations, causing these individuals to perceive threats where none exist and respond with violence they learned in war zones. The segment showed stock footage of combat in Iraq and Afghanistan while discussing Marcus's case, creating a visual association between his situation and wartime violence. No mention was made of Marcus's peaceful 25-year career as an educator, his volunteer work with literacy programs, or his spotless criminal record. Meanwhile, the four accusers were portrayed as innocent victims whose lives had been forever changed by their encounter with Marcus. Chad Morrison appeared on multiple talk shows, describing his terror at being threatened by a trained killer who looked like he could snap at any moment. "You could see it in his eyes," Chad told a sympathetic interviewer. This was a man who had killed people and wasn't afraid to do it again. When he started talking about his military training and how he knew ways to deal with disrespectful people, we knew we were in real danger. The courthouse itself became a daily gathering point for protesters representing both sides of the case. Military veterans who had heard about Marcus's situation drove from across the Midwest to show support, standing in silent formation wearing their service uniforms and holding signs reading, "Honor our veterans," and "Justice for Marcus Washington." On the opposite side of the courthouse steps, members of various community groups carried signs demanding "Safety from violent veterans," and "Protect our children." The two groups maintained an uneasy distance, separated by police barriers and watched closely by officers who feared the situation might explode into violence. Local politicians quickly chose sides based on their electoral calculations. Mayor James Wilson, a Democrat facing re-election, issued a statement calling for calm and respect for the judicial process. His Republican challenger, Susan Martinez, held a press conference demanding maximum penalties for anyone who threatens our young people. The stage was set for a trial that had less to do with determining Marcus Washington's guilt or innocence than with satisfying the political and social agendas of people who saw his case as a symbol of larger cultural battles. In this circus atmosphere, the truth of what had happened in Rosie's kitchen on that quiet morning seemed almost irrelevant. As Marcus prepared for trial in his county jail cell, reading legal documents by the fluorescent light that never dimmed, he found himself thinking about the young soldiers he'd served with in Iraq and Afghanistan. Many of them hadn't made it home. Those who had returned often faced a hostile reception from a country that seemed ashamed of the wars they'd been ordered to fight. Now, decades later, Marcus was discovering that his service still carried no weight when measured against the accusations of four privileged college students who had never sacrificed anything for their country. The Bronze Star Medal that had meant so much to him was sitting in a property envelope, reduced to evidence in a case that threatened to destroy the reputation he'd spent a lifetime building. District Attorney Rebecca Martinez strode into the Wayne County Superior Courtroom wearing a navy blue suit that conveyed both authority and sympathy, a calculated choice designed to appeal to the jury she would spend the next week trying to convince. Her opening statement lasted 48 minutes and painted Marcus Washington not as a decorated veteran, but as a dangerous predator who had used his military training to terrorize innocent young men. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Martinez began, making eye contact with each juror in turn, "we are here today because the defendant, Marcus Washington, a man trained in violence and killing, chose to threaten four young men whose only crime was enjoying a meal at a local restaurant." She gestured toward Chad Morrison, Kyle Patterson, Derek Collins, and Austin Sullivan, who sat in the front row dressed in conservative suits and ties, their parents flanking them like protective shields. "These four young men will tell you about the fear they experienced when this defendant, a trained soldier with decades of weapons experience, made it clear that he could hurt them in ways they couldn't imagine." Defense attorney Jennifer Walsh started to object to the characterization, but Judge Harrison waved her down before she could speak. "The prosecutor will confine her statements to evidence that will be presented," he said mildly, a warning that carried no real teeth. Martinez's strategy became clear as she called her first witness, Dr. Marcus Webb, a criminologist from Wayne State University who specialized in what he termed late-onset veteran violence. Dr. Webb had never met Marcus, never reviewed his military records, and had no direct knowledge of the case, but his credentials impressed the jury. "Dr. Webb, in your professional opinion, are older veterans more likely to engage in threatening behavior than the general population?" Martinez asked. "Absolutely," Webb replied without hesitation. "Veterans, particularly those who served in combat zones like Iraq and Afghanistan, carry what we call trained lethality. Unlike civilian criminals who might threaten violence they can't actually carry out, these individuals possess the skills and psychological conditioning to follow through on their threats." Jennifer Walsh rose to object. "Your Honor, this witness has no knowledge of my client's specific case or psychological state. Sustained, Judge Harrison ruled, but the damage was already done. The jury had heard an expert witness essentially declare that veterans like Marcus were inherently more dangerous than other people. The prosecution's case built systematically over 4 days, each witness adding another layer to the narrative of Marcus as a threatening figure. Chad Morrison took the stand first, his testimony polished through hours of preparation with Martinez's team. He looked at us with these cold, calculating eyes, Chad said, dabbing at tears that appeared on cue. It was like he was deciding the best way to hurt us. Then he said, and I'll never forget these words, young men like you need to learn respect, and I know ways to teach it that you'll never forget. Marcus had never said anything remotely similar, but Chad delivered the fabricated quote with such conviction that 3 jurors visibly recoiled. His performance was masterful, complete with strategic pauses and emotional tremors that made his lies seem like traumatic memories. Kyle Patterson and Derek Collins followed with supporting testimony that corroborated Chad's fabrications. Their stories had been rehearsed to eliminate the contradictions that had appeared in their initial police statements. The defendant kept talking about his military training, Kyle testified. He said he'd been in situations where he had to make people disappear, and that local police couldn't protect us if he decided we needed to be taught a lesson. Again, pure fabrication, but delivered with the earnestness of youth supposedly traumatized by an encounter with violence. Austin Sullivan added the final touches to their fictional narrative. When Mr. Washington stood up, I could see he was evaluating us like targets, Austin said. He mentioned that he still had connections in the military, people who knew how to handle problems quietly. We were terrified. Martinez reinforced these testimonies by calling Officer David Thompson to the stand. Thompson, the arresting officer, embellished his police report significantly during his testimony. When we arrived at the diner, the defendant was agitated and belligerent, Thompson testified. He kept mentioning his military service and making veiled references to his combat experience. We had to restrain him because he appeared ready to escalate the situation. Jennifer Walsh knew this was false. Marcus had been completely cooperative during his arrest, but she lacked the resources to investigate Thompson's history of misconduct or challenge his testimony effectively. The prosecution's master stroke came when Martinez called Dr. Patricia Hendricks, a psychiatrist who had never treated Marcus but claimed expertise in veteran-related violence. Dr. Hendricks testified that Iraq and Afghanistan veterans often experience delayed-onset aggressive episodes triggered by perceived disrespect from younger generations. The defendant's military service, particularly as an Army Ranger, would have conditioned him to respond to threats with calculated violence, Dr. Hendricks explained. When these young men inadvertently triggered his psychological conditioning, he reverted to his military training and began assessing them as potential targets for elimination. The testimony was devastating because it sounded scientific and authoritative, even though it was based on no examination of Marcus and contradicted decades of research showing that veterans were not more violent than the general population. But the jury heard a doctor with impressive credentials declaring that Marcus's military service made him inherently dangerous. Martinez's closing argument tied together all these threads into a narrative of inevitable violence narrowly averted. The defendant is a trained killer who saw 4 young men enjoying themselves and decided they needed to be taught a lesson through intimidation and fear, she told the jury. She paused dramatically, looking at each juror. Marcus Washington may have served his country decades ago, but that service does not give him the right to terrorize civilians today. Your verdict must send a clear message that this community will not tolerate veterans who use their training to threaten innocent people. Throughout the prosecution's case, Marcus sat at the defense table, maintaining the same dignity he'd carried through combat, imprisonment, and now trial. He watched as his military service, the thing he was most proud of in his life, was twisted into evidence of his supposed dangerousness. The Bronze Star he'd earned saving his squad from an IED attack was portrayed as proof that he was capable of violence. The most painful moment came when Martinez displayed Marcus's military ID photograph from Iraq on the courtroom's large screen. Look at this image, she told the jury. This is a young man trained to kill efficiently and without remorse. That training doesn't disappear with age. It lies dormant, waiting for the right trigger. The photograph showed 25-year-old Marcus in his army dress uniform, proud and hopeful, ready to serve his country with honor. 43 years later, that same image was being used to convince a jury that he was a threat to society. As the prosecution rested its case, Marcus felt a familiar sensation from his military days, the knowledge that he was surrounded by enemy forces with no clear path to safety. But this time, there would be no air support, no backup from fellow soldiers. This time, he was truly alone. Jennifer Walsh's defense of Marcus Washington began with the kind of systematic disadvantages that plague public defenders across America: too many cases, too little time, and resources stretched so thin they might as well be non-existent. As she stood to present her opening statement, Walsh carried a briefcase containing exactly 42 pages of notes about Marcus's case, compared to the prosecution's 4 boxes of prepared materials. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Walsh began, her voice lacking the confident authority that had characterized Martinez's presentation, "my client, Marcus Washington, is not the dangerous predator the prosecution wants you to believe. He's a 68-year-old retired teacher who simply asked some disruptive college students to lower their voices." It was a weak opening, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. Walsh hadn't been able to investigate the backgrounds of the 4 accusers, hadn't uncovered their history of minor legal troubles, and most critically, hadn't been granted access to Marcus's military service records that might have shown the jury the kind of man he really was. The first major blow came when Judge Harrison ruled that Marcus's military records were irrelevant to the current charges and therefore inadmissible. This decision eliminated Walsh's ability to present evidence of Marcus's Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and commendations for valor that might have countered the prosecution's portrayal of him as an unstable veteran prone to violence. "Your Honor," Walsh had argued during a sidebar conference, "my client's military service record directly contradicts the state's characterization of him as an unstable veteran prone to violence. These records show 22 years of exemplary service to his country, including multiple commendations for protecting civilian populations in Iraq and Afghanistan." "Ms. Walsh," Judge Harrison replied with barely concealed impatience, "we're not trying your client's military service. We're trying the specific charges brought against him in this courtroom. His war record, whatever it may contain, has no bearing on whether he threatened 4 young men in a diner." The ruling was devastating because it allowed the prosecution to reference Marcus's military training as evidence of his capacity for violence while preventing the defense from showing that same service had been characterized by honor, sacrifice, and protection of others. It was like being allowed to mention that someone owned a gun while being forbidden from explaining they were a police officer. Walsh's attempts to present character witnesses met similar obstacles. Marcus's former students from Cass Technical High School, where he had taught American history for 25 years, were eager to testify about his character, patience, and dedication to helping young people understand their country's struggles with justice and equality. But Judge Harrison ruled that character witnesses were cumulative and limited Walsh to just 2. The first character witness was Dr. Margaret Chen, Marcus's former principal at Cass Tech. Dr. Chen, a soft-spoken woman in her 60s, testified that Marcus had been one of the most respected faculty members in her 3 decades in education. "Mr. Washington was beloved by his students," Dr. Chen said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had dedicated her life to education. "In 25 years of teaching, I never received a single complaint about his conduct. Students often told me that his classes changed their perspectives on American history and civil rights. He had a special gift for reaching troubled students and helping them see better paths for their lives." But Martinez's cross-examination quickly turned Dr. Chen's testimony against Marcus. "Dr. Chen, were you aware that Mr. Washington frequently discussed violence in his classes? He taught about historical violence, yes, the Civil War, both world wars, Iraq, Afghanistan. History includes conflict. And did he ever discuss his personal experiences with violence?" Dr. Chen hesitated, suddenly understanding the trap. He occasionally shared his experiences as a veteran to help students understand the human cost of war and the importance of peaceful conflict resolution. "So he regularly talked about killing and violence with impressionable young people?" "That's not what I said at all. He helped students understand history through personal experience and always emphasized the importance of peaceful solutions to conflicts. But the damage was done. Martinez had managed to make Marcus's excellent teaching record sound like evidence that he was obsessed with violence and used his classroom to intimidate students. The second character witness was Rosa Martinez, the waitress from Rosie's kitchen who had witnessed the actual incident. Rosa's testimony should have been devastating to the prosecution's case, but Walsh lacked the experience to present it effectively. "Mrs. Martinez, you were working at Rosie's kitchen on the morning in question?" Walsh asked. "Yes, I was. Mr. Washington comes in almost every morning. He's always polite, always tips well, never causes any trouble. He's like a grandfather to all of us who work there." "What did you observe that morning?" "Those 4 boys came in drunk and loud. They were saying terrible things about Mr. Washington because he's black. He asked them very politely to be quieter. That's all that happened. He never threatened anyone." But Martinez's cross-examination revealed why the prosecution hadn't been worried about Rosa's testimony. During 25 minutes of aggressive questioning, Martinez established that Rosa was an undocumented immigrant from El Salvador who had been working at the diner without proper papers for 12 years. "Mrs. Martinez, you're not legally authorized to work in the United States, are you?" Rosa's face went pale. I have been trying to get papers. My husband and I, we work hard, we pay taxes. And you understand that testifying here today puts you at risk of deportation?" "Objection." Walsh finally found her voice. "The witness's immigration status is irrelevant to what she observed." "Sustained," Judge Harrison ruled, but again, the damage was done. The jury now viewed Rosa as someone who might lie to avoid deportation, and her testimony about what really happened in the diner was tainted. Worse still, 3 other diner employees who had been scheduled to testify in Marcus's defense suddenly became unavailable. Carlos Mendez, the cook who had witnessed the entire incident, called in sick on the morning he was supposed to testify. Later investigation would reveal that he had received an anonymous phone call threatening to report his immigration status to ICE if he appeared in court. 2 breakfast regulars who had been sitting nearby and could have corroborated Rosa's account simply failed to show up. They later told reporters that their employers had suggested it might not be wise to get involved in such a controversial case. Marcus's health began deteriorating under the stress of the trial. The shrapnel wounds he'd received in Afghanistan, which had been manageable for years, began causing severe pain that left him visibly uncomfortable in the courtroom. His right shoulder, injured when his convoy hit an IED outside Kandahar in 2004, swelled to the point where he could barely lift his arm. "Dad, you need to see a doctor," his daughter Angela whispered during a court recess. "You look like you're in agony." "I can't afford to look weak in front of this jury," Marcus replied, gritting his teeth against a wave of pain. "They already think I'm dangerous. If they see me as sick and unstable too, it's over." But his deteriorating condition only made things worse. Jurors watched him grimace when he stood, saw him favor his injured shoulder, and observed the way his hands sometimes trembled from pain medication. Rather than evoking sympathy, his visible suffering seemed to confirm the prosecution's narrative that he was an unstable veteran whose body and mind had been damaged by war. The impact on Marcus's family was devastating. Angela had exhausted her savings to travel back and forth from Chicago for the trial, and her employer at Rush University Medical Center was growing impatient with her extended absences. Her teenage daughter, Jasmine, was being bullied at school by classmates who had seen her grandfather's mugshot on the news. "They're calling Grandpa a terrorist," Jasmine told her mother during one of their nightly phone calls. "They say he's going to prison for threatening to kill white people. Some kids won't even sit near me at lunch." Even worse, some members of Marcus's own community began distancing themselves from him as the media coverage intensified. The pastor at Mount Olive Baptist Church, where Marcus had been a member for 15 years, suggested it might be best if he didn't attend services until this situation was resolved. Several longtime friends stopped returning his phone calls from the county jail. "I understand their position," Marcus told Angela during one of her visits. They have families to protect, businesses to run. They can't afford to be associated with someone the whole city thinks is a criminal. The local media coverage became increasingly hostile as the trial progressed. Channel 7's evening newscast featured a segment titled "Veteran Violence in Our Community" that included interviews with unnamed experts who discussed the epidemic of unstable veterans threatening civilians. "We're seeing more and more cases like this," claimed Dr. Robert Sterling, a psychiatrist who had never treated a veteran but appeared regularly on local television as an expert on various topics. "These men come home from war zones and never fully integrate back into peaceful society. They see threats everywhere and respond with the violence they were trained to use." The segment showed stock footage of combat in Iraq and Afghanistan while discussing Marcus's case, reinforcing the connection between his military service and supposed propensity for violence. No mention was made of the millions of veterans who had served honorably and returned to productive civilian lives. By the 6th day of trial, Marcus was seriously considering accepting a plea bargain that would have resulted in 2 years in prison and 5 years of probation. The prospect of spending even a day in prison for something he hadn't done made him physically sick, but the alternative seemed to be a lengthy sentence after inevitable conviction. "Mr. Washington, I have to be honest with you," Walsh said during their final strategy meeting. "The prosecution's case is strong, and our defense has been limited by the court's rulings. A plea bargain might be your best option at this point." Marcus looked at his court-appointed attorney, this young woman who had tried her best with inadequate resources and impossible circumstances. "Ms. Walsh, if I plead guilty to something I didn't do, doesn't that make me a liar? And if I go to prison for a crime I didn't commit, doesn't that make this whole system a lie?" Walsh had no answer for that. She was 29 years old, 4 years out of law school, handling her first major trial, and slowly realizing that the justice system she had believed in was failing right in front of her eyes. As Marcus returned to his cell that night, he found himself thinking about the young soldiers who had served under him in Iraq and Afghanistan. He had taught them that America was worth fighting for, that the Constitution and Bill of Rights represented ideals worth dying to protect. Many of them had died believing those words. Now, decades later, Marcus was discovering that those ideals meant nothing when measured against the word of 4 privileged college students who had never sacrificed anything for their country. The Constitution he had sworn to defend seemed powerless to protect him from lies told by people who saw his skin color and military service as evidence of guilt rather than honor. The prosecution's star witness took the stand on the 7th day of trial with the confidence of someone who had been preparing for this moment for weeks. Chad Morrison, dressed in a conservative charcoal suit that made him look younger and more innocent than his 20 years, settled into the witness chair and looked directly at the jury with carefully practiced sincerity. District Attorney Rebecca Martinez approached the witness stand with the measured pace of a prosecutor who knew she was about to deliver a knockout blow. Her questions were designed to elicit maximum emotional impact while reinforcing the narrative she had been building since her opening statement. "Chad, I want you to take your time and tell the jury exactly what happened on the morning of April 3rd at Rosie's kitchen," Martinez began, her voice gentle and encouraging. Chad took a deep breath, as if summoning courage to relive a traumatic experience. "My friends Kyle, Derek, Austin, and I had been studying all night for final exams. We decided to grab breakfast before heading home to sleep. We were just trying to have a normal meal when this man," he pointed dramatically at Marcus, "decided we were too loud for his liking." The pointing gesture was deliberate, designed to make Marcus appear threatening even while sitting silently at the defense table. Several jurors followed Chad's gesture and stared at Marcus with obvious suspicion. "What happened next?" Martinez prompted. "At first, he just stared at us with these cold, calculating eyes, like he was studying us, figuring out our weaknesses. Then he stood up and walked over to our table. He was big, intimidating, and he had this way of moving that made it clear he knew how to hurt people. Marcus had never approached their table, never stood up except when the police arrived. But Chad delivered this fabrication with such conviction that 3 jurors took notes. The lie was becoming truth through repetition and performance. "Did the defendant say anything to you?" Chad nodded gravely. He said, and I'll never forget these exact words, "Young men like you need to learn respect, and I know ways to teach it that you'll never forget." Then he started talking about his time in Iraq and Afghanistan, how he had dealt with disrespectful punks before. Again, pure fabrication, but Chad's delivery made it sound like a quote he had memorized through trauma rather than invented through malice. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke, adding authenticity to his performance. "How did that make you feel?" "Terrified," Chad replied without hesitation. This was a trained killer telling us he knew how to hurt us in ways we couldn't imagine. He kept mentioning his military service like it was a threat. He said local police couldn't protect us if he decided we needed to be educated. Jennifer Walsh objected to the hearsay, but Judge Harrison allowed Chad to continue describing his emotional state rather than quoting Marcus directly. It was a distinction without a difference that allowed Chad to put words in Marcus's mouth while technically avoiding direct quotation. "Chad, did you feel that you and your friends were in immediate danger?" "Absolutely. This man was a trained Army Ranger who had killed people in war. He was making it clear that he could do the same to us if we didn't show him what he considered proper respect. We were just college kids trying to eat breakfast, and this veteran was threatening to hurt us because we were talking normally." Martinez spent 45 minutes walking Chad through his fabricated account, each question designed to reinforce the image of Marcus as a dangerous predator who had used his military training to terrorize innocent young men. Chad's performance was flawless, complete with strategic pauses, emotional tremors, and direct eye contact with sympathetic jurors. The most damaging moment came when Martinez asked Chad to describe Marcus's demeanor during the alleged threats. "He had this look in his eyes that I can only describe as predatory," Chad said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper that forced the jury to lean forward. "Like he was deciding which one of us he would hurt first. He kept flexing his hands like he was imagining what it would feel like to wrap them around our throats." Marcus had done no such thing, but Chad's description was so vivid and specific that it felt real to jurors who had never witnessed actual violence. The fabricated detail about hand flexing was particularly effective because it suggested premeditation and gave the threat a physical component that made it more frightening. Kyle Patterson followed Chad to the witness stand, his testimony carefully coordinated to support his friend's lies while adding new details that made the fabricated incident seem more elaborate and threatening. The defendant kept talking about his connections in the military, Kyle testified. He said he knew people who could make problems disappear quietly, people who knew how to handle situations without involving local law enforcement. This was a particularly insidious lie because it suggested that Marcus had not only threatened the teenagers but had also claimed to have access to some kind of criminal network of violent veterans. It played into paranoid fantasies about secret military cabals while making Marcus appear to be part of a larger threat to community safety. Derek Collins and Austin Sullivan completed the quartet of perjury with testimony that added psychological manipulation to the mix of fabricated threats. The defendant said he could tell we came from privileged families, that we probably thought we were better than people like him, Derek testified. He said rich kids like us needed to learn that money couldn't protect us from men who had killed for their country. This testimony was designed to appeal to jurors who might have some resentment toward wealthy, privileged young people by suggesting that Marcus's threats were motivated by class warfare rather than simple irritation at their noise level. It also reinforced the prosecution's theme that Marcus's military service had made him dangerous rather than honorable. Officer David Thompson's testimony built on the teenager's lies by embellishing his police report with details that hadn't appeared in his original documentation. When we arrived at the scene, the defendant was agitated and confrontational, Thompson testified. He kept mentioning his military service and making references to his combat experience. We had to use assertive verbal commands to get him to comply with our instructions. In reality, Marcus had been completely cooperative during his arrest, but Thompson's testimony suggested that he had been difficult and potentially violent. The officer's uniform and badge gave his lies an official authority that made them more credible to jurors than the truth would have been. The prosecution's closing argument was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation that tied together all the fabricated testimony into a narrative of barely averted tragedy. Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard from 4 young men whose only crime was enjoying a meal at a local restaurant, Martinez began, her voice rising with righteous indignation. "You have heard how they were terrorized by a man who used his military training not to protect and serve, but to intimidate and threaten." She paused dramatically, scanning the jury box to make eye contact with each juror. "The defendant wants you to believe that his military service makes him a hero. But what kind of hero threatens college students? What kind of patriot uses his training to terrorize the very people he was supposed to protect?" Martinez's closing lasted 58 minutes and systematically dismantled every possible sympathy that jurors might have felt for Marcus. His military service became evidence of his capacity for violence. His calm demeanor during trial became proof that he was calculating and manipulative. His age became a factor that made him more dangerous, not less, because it suggested years of accumulated resentment. "Marcus Washington is not the victim here," Martinez concluded. "He is a man who decided that 4 young people deserved to be terrorized because they didn't show him what he considered proper deference. Your verdict must send a clear message that this community will not tolerate veterans who use their training to threaten innocent civilians." Jennifer Walsh's closing argument was a pale shadow of the prosecution's presentation, hampered by her inexperience and the court's rulings that had prevented her from presenting evidence of Marcus's true character. "Members of the jury, my client is not the monster the prosecution has painted," Walsh began weakly. "He is a 68-year-old retired teacher who simply asked some loud college students to be more considerate of other customers." But Walsh lacked the resources and experience to effectively counter the prosecution's narrative. She couldn't present Marcus's military decorations, couldn't call character witnesses who might have testified to his peaceful nature, and couldn't investigate the backgrounds of his accusers to expose their lies. Judge Harrison's jury instructions seemed to favor the prosecution, emphasizing that the jurors should consider the totality of the defendant's conduct and that military training could be considered as evidence of the defendant's capacity to carry out threatened violence. As the jury filed out to begin deliberations, Marcus watched their faces for any sign of sympathy or doubt. He saw none. The 12 people who would decide his fate looked at him with a mixture of fear, distrust, and something worse, the cold certainty that they had already made up their minds. The jury deliberated for exactly 2 hours and 15 minutes, barely enough time to elect a foreman, take a preliminary vote, and fill out the verdict forms. Court observers who had followed the trial knew that such a quick deliberation almost always meant a conviction, but the speed still shocked Marcus's supporters, who had hoped that reasonable doubt might require more consideration. Judge Harrison's courtroom was packed when the jury returned, with Marcus's family occupying the first row behind the defense table while Chad Morrison's supporters filled the opposite side. Media representatives filled every available seat, their cameras focused on Marcus's face as the moment of truth approached. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Harrison asked as the 12 jurors filed back into their seats. "We have, Your Honor," replied Thomas Bradley, a 58-year-old insurance agent who had been elected foreman. Bradley held the verdict forms with steady hands, his expression revealing nothing about what the jury had decided. "On the charge of terroristic threatening in the 2nd degree, how do you find?" Bradley's voice carried clearly through the silent courtroom. "We find the defendant, Marcus Washington, guilty." The word "guilty" hit Marcus like a physical blow, but he maintained his military posture and showed no reaction beyond a slight tightening around his eyes. Behind him, his daughter Angela gasped audibly while Chad Morrison's mother smiled with satisfaction. "On the charge of disturbing the peace, how do you find?" "We find the defendant guilty." "On the charge of intimidating witnesses, how do you find?" "We find the defendant guilty." Judge Harrison thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for the following week, allowing time for pre-sentence investigations and victim impact statements. As the gavel struck the wooden block with finality, Marcus Washington officially became a convicted felon, his spotless 68-year record of citizenship destroyed by lies told under oath. The media reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Channel 7 led their evening newscast with "Guilty, Veteran Convicted of Terroristic Threats," showing Marcus's mugshot next to footage of him being led from the courtroom in handcuffs. The story portrayed the verdict as a victory for community safety and a warning to other veterans who might consider using their military training to intimidate civilians. This conviction sends a clear message, District Attorney Rebecca Martinez told reporters on the courthouse steps. Military service, no matter how distinguished, does not give anyone the right to threaten innocent people. Our community is safer tonight because this dangerous individual will face the consequences of his actions. The sentencing hearing 1 week later was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to maximize Marcus's punishment while minimizing any sympathy the court might feel for his age or service record. Martinez had prepared meticulously, lining up victim impact statements and expert testimony that would justify the harshest possible sentence. Chad Morrison was the first to address the court during victim impact statements, his performance even more polished than his trial testimony. Dressed in a dark suit and speaking with practiced emotion, Chad painted a picture of lasting trauma and ongoing fear. "Your Honor, what Marcus Washington did to us that morning has changed our lives forever," Chad began, his voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "I used to love going out with friends, enjoying simple pleasures like breakfast at a local diner. Now I'm afraid to go anywhere without looking over my shoulder, wondering if some unstable veteran might decide I deserve to be taught a lesson." Chad's mother, Patricia Morrison, followed with her own statement about the devastating impact Marcus's actions had on their family. "We've had to install a security system in our home because we're afraid he might come after Chad when he gets out of prison," she said, dabbing at tears with a tissue. "My son has nightmares about being hunted by a trained killer who thinks he did something wrong by simply existing while white." The racial component of Patricia Morrison's statement was subtle but unmistakable, designed to tap into fears about angry black men seeking revenge against white families. It was a particularly vicious touch that transformed Marcus from an individual defendant into a symbol of racial resentment. Kyle Patterson, Derek Collins, and Austin Sullivan delivered similar statements, each emphasizing their ongoing fear and the supposed trauma of being threatened by a professional killer. Their parents followed with their own accounts of how the incident had affected their families, creating a chorus of white victimhood that dominated the sentencing hearing. Dr. Patricia Hendricks returned to provide expert testimony about the ongoing danger Marcus represented to the community. "Your Honor, the defendant's military training, combined with his demonstrated willingness to threaten civilians, makes him an exceptional risk for recidivism," she testified. "Veterans like Mr. Washington often escalate their behavior when they feel their initial intimidation tactics have been unsuccessful." Again, Dr. Hendricks had never examined Marcus and based her testimony on no actual evidence, but her credentials gave weight to speculation presented as expert opinion. Her recommendation for maximum incarceration was exactly what Martinez needed to justify a harsh sentence. When given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, Marcus rose slowly from the defense table, his injured shoulder causing him visible discomfort. He had prepared no formal statement, choosing instead to speak from the heart about his service, his character, and his innocence. "Your Honor, I have never in my life threatened another human being outside of combat situations where my country asked me to defend freedom and democracy," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I served 4 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, not because I enjoyed violence, but because I believed in protecting the rights and freedoms that make America special." He paused, looking directly at Judge Harrison. "I asked 4 young men to lower their voices in a restaurant. That is all I did. I made no threats, used no intimidating language, and displayed no aggressive behavior. The witnesses who could confirm this were intimidated into silence, while those who lied under oath were rewarded with victim status." Marcus's statement lasted only 4 minutes, but it carried the dignity and authority of a man who had faced enemy fire and refused to be broken by civilian injustice. "I will not apologize for something I did not do, and I will not dishonor my service by pretending that asking for common courtesy is equivalent to making terrorist threats." Judge Harrison's sentencing decision reflected the political pressure he faced and his own apparent belief in the prosecution's narrative. "Mr. Washington, while I acknowledge your military service, that service does not excuse your conduct on the morning in question," Harrison began. "You used your size, your military bearing, and your combat experience to intimidate 4 young men who were doing nothing more than enjoying a meal." The judge continued for 12 minutes, essentially accepting the prosecution's version of events as fact while dismissing Marcus's denials as self-serving lies. The court sentences you to 6 years imprisonment in the Michigan Department of Corrections, with the possibility of parole after serving 65% of your sentence. The sentence was harsh, even by the standards of Wayne County, where judges routinely gave lighter punishment to defendants convicted of actual assault. But Marcus had become a symbol rather than an individual, and his punishment was designed to send a message about the consequences of challenging white privilege while black. As Marcus was led from the courtroom in handcuffs and leg shackles, protesters outside cheered the result. Signs reading, "Justice for Chad," and "Lock up dangerous veterans," waved in the air as news cameras captured the moment for evening broadcasts across Detroit. Angela Washington collapsed in tears as she watched her father being taken away to begin a prison sentence for a crime he hadn't committed. The man who had taught her about justice, equality, and the Constitution was being destroyed by the very system he had fought to defend. The transport van that carried Marcus to Kinross Correctional Facility was a final indignity in a process that had stripped him of everything except his dignity and his knowledge of the truth. As Detroit disappeared behind them, Marcus reflected on the country he had served and the ideals he had believed in. He had been convicted by a jury that saw his skin color and military service as evidence of guilt rather than honor. He had been sentenced by a judge who valued political expediency over justice. He had been abandoned by a community that chose comfortable lies over inconvenient truths. But even as the prison gates closed behind him, Marcus Washington remained unbroken. Somewhere in the darkness of his cell, he held on to the truth of what had really happened in Rosie's kitchen, and the hope that someday, somehow, justice would prevail. Kinross Correctional Facility's intake process was designed to strip away every vestige of dignity and individuality from new inmates, transforming them from citizens into numbers in the Michigan Department of Corrections system. Marcus Washington endured the humiliation with the same stoic discipline that had carried him through enemy interrogation training in the Army, but the psychological impact was devastating for a man who had spent his entire life serving others. The strip search, conducted by guards who seemed to take pleasure in ordering around the terrorist veteran, was followed by a delousing shower with industrial soap that burned his skin. Marcus's personal effects, including the wedding ring he had worn for 45 years until his wife's death, were catalogued and stored in a property room he might never see again. Inmate 89472, the processing guard announced, reading from Marcus's new identification bracelet. "You're in cell block C, tier 2. Keep your mouth shut, follow orders, and you might make it out of here in one piece." Marcus's cellmate was Jerome Williams, a 26-year-old from Flint who was serving 12 years for armed robbery. Jerome had been prepared to assert dominance over the old man assigned to share his 10 by 8-foot concrete box, but something about Marcus's bearing made him reconsider his usual intimidation tactics. "So what they got you in here for, Pops?" Jerome asked as Marcus made up his narrow bunk with military precision. "They say I threatened some college kids," Marcus replied quietly. "Truth is, I asked them to lower their voices in a restaurant." Jerome laughed bitterly. "Man, they'll lock us up for breathing while black. What you do before this happened?" "Taught American history at Cass Tech for 25 years. Before that, 22 years in the Army, Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia." The mention of military service changed the entire dynamic of their relationship. Jerome had grown up hearing stories about his grandfather's service in Vietnam, and despite his criminal record, he maintained deep respect for veterans who had served their country. "Iraq and Afghanistan, huh? My cousin was over there. Said it was hell on earth." "It was," Marcus confirmed. "But we did our duty, came home, and tried to build something better." Word of Marcus's military service spread quickly through the prison population, carried by the informal communication network that exists in every correctional facility. Within a week, even hardened criminals were treating the 68-year-old history teacher with a respect that surprised the guards. "That old man in C Block fought in Iraq and Afghanistan," inmates would whisper to newcomers. "Killed terrorists for his country, then came home and taught kids about freedom. Don't mess with him unless you want problems." Marcus's daily routine became a study in dignity maintained under impossible circumstances. He woke at 5:30 a.m., as he had for 50 years, and spent an hour in silent reflection before the morning count. He attended every educational program the prison offered, tutoring younger inmates in basic literacy and helping them prepare for GED examinations. Letters began arriving within 3 weeks of Marcus's incarceration, first dozens, then hundreds from veterans across America who had heard about his case through military networks and social media. The Veterans of Foreign Wars post in Grand Rapids sent a package of books and magazines. American Legion chapters from 15 states wrote expressing support and outrage at his treatment. "Brother, we got your six," wrote Sergeant Major Robert Chen, an Iraq veteran from California. "What they did to you is an insult to every man and woman who ever wore the uniform. Don't let them break you. Justice is coming." The letters provided Marcus with something he had lost during the trial, proof that not everyone believed the lies told about him in that Detroit courtroom. Fellow veterans understood that military service created bonds of honor and mutual respect that civilians often failed to comprehend. Angela exhausted her savings and borrowed against her Chicago home to hire appellate attorney David Harrison, a former Marine who specialized in cases involving veterans wrongfully convicted by civilian courts. Harrison's initial review of Marcus's case revealed multiple constitutional violations and procedural errors that should have resulted in a mistrial. "Your father's trial was a travesty," Harrison told Angela during their first meeting. "The court's refusal to admit his military service record, the intimidation of defense witnesses, the prosecutor's inflammatory statements about veterans in general, any one of these issues should be grounds for reversal." But appeals moved slowly through the Michigan court system, and Marcus was settling into the grim reality of prison life while lawyers filed motions and argued legal technicalities that might take years to resolve. The first crack in the wall of lies surrounding Marcus's conviction came from an unexpected source, investigative journalist Patricia Santos of the Detroit Free Press. Santos had covered the trial and been troubled by inconsistencies in the prosecution's case that other reporters had ignored. Her investigation revealed that Chad Morrison had been arrested 3 times for underage drinking and once for marijuana possession, charges that had been dropped through his family's political connections. Kyle Patterson had been suspended from the University of Michigan for academic dishonesty, while Derek Collins had a sealed juvenile record for assault that his wealthy parents had managed to expunge. Austin Sullivan had been kicked out of 2 private schools for behavioral problems before landing at a community college. These weren't innocent college students traumatized by a dangerous veteran, Santos wrote in a series of articles that began appearing 8 months after Marcus's conviction. These were privileged young men with histories of lying to authority figures, whose word was taken over that of a decorated war hero simply because of the color of his skin. Santos's articles generated renewed interest in Marcus's case among civil rights organizations and veteran advocacy groups. The NAACP assigned lawyers to review his conviction, while the Veterans Legal Defense Fund began preparing a federal civil rights lawsuit against Wayne County. 10 months into Marcus's sentence, Angela received a phone call that would change everything. She was working a double shift at Rush University Medical Center when her phone rang with a call from an unknown number with a Washington, D.C. area code. "Is this Angela Washington, daughter of Marcus Washington?" the caller asked in a voice that carried unmistakable military authority. "Yes, who is this, sir?" "My name is Colonel Patricia Williams, United States Army, retired. I've been searching for your father for over 35 years, and I just learned about his situation through a friend at the Pentagon who saw the news coverage." Angela felt her heart racing. "Colonel, I don't understand. What do you know about my father?" "Miss Washington, your father saved my life and the lives of 23 other American soldiers in Afghanistan in 2006. What happened to him in that courtroom is not just a personal tragedy, it's a national disgrace that dishonors every veteran who ever served this country." Colonel Patricia Williams explained that she had been a young lieutenant when her reconnaissance patrol was ambushed by Taliban forces in the mountains outside Kandahar. For 8 hours, Marcus had held off an entire enemy company with precision rifle fire, allowing helicopters to evacuate the wounded while calling in airstrikes that broke the enemy assault. "Your father was recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross," Colonel Williams continued. "But the paperwork got lost in the chaos of rotating commands, and institutional racism in the military bureaucracy ensured that his heroism was never properly recognized. I've carried that guilt for 35 years. Colonel, can you help him? Can you testify about what really happened over there? I'm flying to Detroit tonight. I have classified documents that were declassified 2 years ago, military records that prove your father is one of the greatest heroes of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. This conviction is an insult to his service and to every principle this nation claims to represent. As Colonel Williams spoke, Angela realized that her father's nightmare might finally be ending. Somewhere in the bureaucracy of the Pentagon, evidence existed that could vindicate Marcus and expose the lies that had destroyed his reputation. Colonel, my father is scheduled to be transferred to maximum security tomorrow morning because they claim he's been organizing other inmates. If you're going to help him, it has to be now. I'll be there before sunrise, the colonel promised. Your father has waited 35 years for the recognition he deserves. He won't wait another day. Colonel Patricia Williams's helicopter touched down on the Wayne County Courthouse parking lot at 6:52 a.m., just as the morning sun cast long shadows across downtown Detroit. The decorated colonel emerged from the aircraft carrying a briefcase containing classified documents that had been declassified only 2 years earlier, papers that would expose one of the most shameful cover-ups in modern American military history. Williams cut an imposing figure even at 58 years old, her silver hair perfectly groomed and her dress uniform bearing ribbons that represented 3 decades of distinguished service, including 4 combat tours and a Bronze Star earned in Iraq. But nothing in her impressive military career meant more to her than the debt she owed to Marcus Washington. The media had been alerted to the colonel's arrival by Angela, and cameras from every major network affiliate in Michigan captured the moment when Williams strode up the courthouse steps with the bearing of a woman on a mission of honor. Behind her walked Major James Rodriguez, a Pentagon spokesperson, and Captain Sarah Chen, a military historian who had helped piece together the true story of what happened near Forward Operating Base Chapman in 2006. Ladies and gentlemen, Colonel Williams announced to the assembled reporters, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, I am here to present evidence that will prove Marcus Washington is not only innocent of the charges brought against him, but is one of the greatest heroes in the history of American military service. Inside the courthouse, emergency hearings were already being convened as word spread that new evidence had emerged in the Marcus Washington case. Judge Harrison, facing intense political pressure from the governor's office and the Pentagon, agreed to an immediate evidentiary hearing that would determine whether Marcus's conviction could stand in light of the revelations about to be presented. Colonel Williams's testimony began with a detailed account of Operation Desert Shield, a classified reconnaissance mission that had taken place on September 14, 2006, in the mountains near the Pakistani border. Lieutenant Patricia Williams's patrol had been tasked with gathering intelligence on Taliban supply routes when they walked into a carefully planned ambush. We were pinned down by an entire enemy company, Colonel Williams testified, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the memories. 4 of my soldiers were already dead, and the rest of us were wounded. We had no chance of survival unless someone could provide covering fire to allow helicopter evacuation. That someone was Staff Sergeant Marcus Washington, positioned on a ridge 1,200 meters away with his M24 sniper rifle. For the next 8 hours, while enemy forces tried to overrun the trapped patrol, Marcus systematically eliminated enemy machine gun positions, mortar crews, and squad leaders with precision that bordered on superhuman. Staff Sergeant Washington killed 67 enemy combatants that day, Colonel Williams continued. But more importantly, his accurate fire allowed us to call in airstrikes and helicopter gunships that saved 23 American lives, including mine. The classified documents Colonel Williams presented told a story that had been buried for 35 years in Pentagon filing cabinets. Marcus's commanding officer, Major William Carson, had recommended him for the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest decoration for military valor. Supporting statements from every survivor of the ambush confirmed that Marcus's actions had prevented a massacre. But the recommendation had disappeared into the military bureaucracy during a period of command changes and budget cuts. When Major Carson was killed in a helicopter crash 6 weeks later, no one else followed up on Marcus's nomination for the Distinguished Service Cross. What happened next was one of the most shameful episodes in modern military history. Major Rodriguez testified, reading from previously classified internal Pentagon memos. When Staff Sergeant Washington's Distinguished Service Cross recommendation was reviewed in Washington, it was rejected not because his actions didn't merit the honor, but because of institutional racism that pervaded the military hierarchy. One memo, written by a Pentagon official whose name had been redacted but whose racism was explicit, stated that Negro soldiers should not be awarded high decorations, as it sends the wrong message about military leadership and could encourage unrest among colored troops. Marcus's heroism had been deliberately suppressed, his Distinguished Service Cross recommendation filed away and forgotten because military officials in 2006 believed that recognizing a black soldier's extraordinary valor would threaten white supremacy in the armed forces. The revelation sent shock waves through the courtroom and beyond. Within hours, every major news network in America was broadcasting the story of how a genuine war hero had been denied recognition for 35 years, then falsely convicted of terrorism for asking college students to be quiet in a restaurant. Social media exploded with outrage as the hashtag Justice for Marcus Washington began trending nationally. Veterans organizations across the country issued statements demanding Marcus's immediate release and full exoneration. The veterans of foreign wars called his conviction an insult to every American who ever wore the uniform, while the American Legion demanded congressional hearings into both his false conviction and the military suppression of his heroic service. Political leaders rushed to distance themselves from the injustice as public opinion shifted dramatically in Marcus's favor. Governor Jennifer Martinez called Marcus's conviction a stain on Michigan's commitment to justice and demanded an immediate review. Senators from both parties issued statements calling for federal intervention, while the White House announced that President Williams was deeply concerned about the case. The most dramatic moment came when Colonel Williams presented the final piece of evidence, testimony from the 4 college students who had fabricated the charges against Marcus. Under pressure from a renewed FBI investigation triggered by the national attention, Chad Morrison, Kyle Patterson, Derek Collins, and Austin Sullivan had finally admitted that they had lied under oath. "We made it all up," Chad confessed in a video statement recorded by federal investigators. "Mr. Washington never threatened us. He just asked us to be quieter, and we got mad because we were drunk and thought he was being disrespectful. We figured no one would believe an old black man over 4 white college students." The confession was devastating, not just for its admission of perjury, but for its casual racism and privileged assumption that the justice system would automatically side with white accusers over a black defendant. Chad's statement revealed the ugly truth that Marcus's conviction had been based entirely on racial prejudice disguised as concern for public safety. Kyle Patterson, Derek Collins, and Austin Sullivan provided similar confessions, each admitting that they had fabricated their testimony and coordinated their lies to ensure consistency. They revealed that Chad's family had hired a lawyer to coach them on their testimony and that they had been promised that charges would never be filed against them if they maintained their false accusations. District Attorney Rebecca Martinez's response to the revelations was a masterpiece of political damage control that fooled no one. "If new evidence has emerged that calls into question Mr. Washington's conviction, my office will of course review it thoroughly," she announced at a hastily called press conference. But the political calculus had already shifted decisively against her. Facing a mayoral election in 8 months, Martinez found herself defending the prosecution of a war hero based on fabricated testimony from racist college students. Her poll numbers collapsed overnight as Detroit voters realized they had elected someone who valued political ambition over justice. By evening, crowds had gathered outside Kinross Correctional Facility, demanding Marcus's immediate release. Veterans groups organized a convoy of motorcycles that stretched for miles along Interstate 75, their riders wearing patches that read, "Free Marcus Washington." Inside the prison, Marcus learned about the day's revelations from news reports on the common room television. For the first time in 14 months, he allowed himself to believe that the truth might actually matter more than lies, and that the country he had served with honor might finally acknowledge the debt it owed him. As night fell over Detroit, emergency motions were being filed in both state and federal courts, demanding Marcus's immediate release. The weight of public opinion, political pressure, and undeniable evidence was finally breaking down the wall of lies that had imprisoned an innocent man for crimes he never committed. Colonel Williams spent the evening in the Renaissance Center Marriott, preparing for what she hoped would be Marcus's release the following morning. After 35 years of carrying guilt about her failure to ensure proper recognition for the man who saved her life, Patricia Williams was finally in position to pay the debt that had haunted her for over 3 decades. The emergency hearing convened at 8 a.m. sharp in Judge Harrison's courtroom, which was packed beyond capacity with media representatives, veterans, civil rights activists, and curious citizens who wanted to witness what many were calling the most dramatic reversal in Michigan legal history. Outside, thousands of supporters had gathered in a peaceful demonstration that stretched for blocks around the courthouse. Judge Harrison, whose reputation would never recover from his role in Marcus's wrongful conviction, had no choice but to dismiss all charges against Marcus with prejudice, meaning they could never be refiled. The evidence presented by Colonel Williams was so overwhelming, and the college student's confessions so damning, that any other decision would have destroyed what remained of his judicial career. "Mr. Washington," Judge Harrison said as Marcus stood before the bench in his orange prison uniform, flanked by a team of high-powered attorneys who had volunteered their services, "this court finds that your conviction was based on perjured testimony, and that substantial evidence of your innocence has been presented. All charges against you are hereby dismissed with prejudice." The courtroom erupted in cheers as Marcus, maintaining the same dignity he had shown throughout his ordeal, simply nodded his acknowledgement. Colonel Williams, watching from the front row, felt 35 years of guilt lifting from her shoulders as justice was finally served. Marcus's release from custody was delayed only by the paperwork required to process him out of the state corrections system. When he finally walked through the gates of Kinross Correctional Facility at 3:15 p.m., he was greeted by a crowd of over 8,000 supporters, including hundreds of veterans who had driven from across the Midwest to witness his vindication. The first person to reach Marcus was his daughter Angela, who had maintained her faith in his innocence through 14 months of nightmare. Their embrace, captured by dozens of cameras and broadcast live across the nation, became an iconic image of justice delayed but not denied. Colonel Williams was the second person to greet Marcus, and their meeting was charged with emotion that both had held in check for decades. "Staff Sergeant Washington," the colonel said, using Marcus's old military rank, "I owe you an apology that's 35 years overdue. You saved my life and 23 others, and this country failed to honor that sacrifice." "Colonel," Marcus replied with the quiet dignity that had sustained him through his ordeal, "we both served our country to the best of our ability. That's all any soldier can do." The media frenzy surrounding Marcus's release continued for weeks as his story became a symbol of both systemic racism and the power of truth to eventually overcome lies. Major networks competed to land interviews with the man who had been transformed overnight from convicted terrorist to national hero. District Attorney Rebecca Martinez's political career ended abruptly when she withdrew from the mayoral race 5 days after Marcus's release, facing certain defeat and possible criminal charges for prosecuting a case she knew was based on fabricated evidence. Federal investigators opened a civil rights investigation into her office's conduct, leading to ethics violations that would eventually result in her disbarment. Officers David Thompson and Maria Gonzalez, the arresting officers who had embellished their reports and testimony, were fired from the Detroit Police Department and faced federal charges for violating Marcus's civil rights under color of law. Their termination sent a message throughout the department that racial bias and false testimony would no longer be tolerated. Chad Morrison, Kyle Patterson, Derek Collins, and Austin Sullivan were charged with perjury, filing false reports, and conspiracy to deny civil rights. Their guilty pleas resulted in prison sentences of 2 years each and civil judgments that bankrupted their families. Chad's parents, who had orchestrated much of the cover-up, faced their own criminal charges and social ostracism from Detroit society. The civil lawsuit Marcus filed against Wayne County, the Detroit Police Department, and the individual defendants resulted in a settlement of $18.5 million, making it one of the largest wrongful conviction awards in Michigan history. Marcus announced that he would donate most of the money to establish the Marcus Washington Foundation for wrongfully convicted veterans, ensuring that other veterans facing similar injustices would have access to proper legal representation. This case also illustrates the critical importance of investigative journalism and advocacy groups in exposing wrongful convictions. Without Patricia Santos's reporting and Colonel Williams's intervention, Marcus might have served his entire sentence while the truth remained buried in Pentagon files. Perhaps most significantly, Marcus's story shows that redemption is possible even after devastating injustice. His decision to establish a foundation helping other wrongfully convicted veterans transforms personal suffering into systemic change. His example proves that heroes are defined not by their inability to be knocked down, but by their refusal to stay down. True justice requires constant vigilance from citizens willing to demand accountability from their institutions and protection for the innocent. The fight for equality and justice is never finished, it simply passes from one generation to the next, carried forward by those who refuse to let the arc of the moral universe bend toward anything but justice.